How do you define heroism? And how do you capture that definition in game mechanics? Games like Dungeons & Dragons and Pathfinder, which market themselves as heroic fantasy games, represent the player character's heroic status with power. Even level 1 player characters are established to be above the common rabble. And an iconic part of their gameplay loop is how these characters gain power over time. However, in the TTRPG Distal, heroism is defined by adversity. Although Distal characters also gain power by leveling up over time, the longer they adventure, the greater the risk that their adventure ends for good. Hi, I'm John, and this is Dragon Mind, where we discover our best selves through gaming, and today we're reviewing Distal, a grounded, not gritty, heroic fantasy TTRPG. Let's get into it. Alright, before getting too far into Distal, I want to start by saying that this is the first of a review series I'm doing where I'm playtesting a lot of different TTRPGs by myself, for myself, with inconsistent scheduling ever serving as an obstacle for group play, and with the tone of some of these TTRPGs I'm really interested in being rather specific. I'm instead using a bit of gaming and a bit of journaling to get a taste of a lot of different systems for myself. If you're curious about my niche process of playtesting these systems, you can check out my video, Journal Gaming, which, as I've learned recently from Reddit, is probably an inaccurate label. As I said in that video, journal games are a specific type of TTRPG product. And so while, yes, I'm doing a bit of gaming, and yes, I'm doing a bit of journaling, the label of journal gaming can be a little bit confusing. So instead, for right now, I'm going to call it prose gaming, because again, it's the closest thing I think that captures what I'm actually doing. One more thing to get out of the way, this is not going to be some kind of objective, comprehensive review. Unlike pretty much every other game I'm going to be playtesting this way, I am really good friends with Distal's creator, Rel. We do the Untitled TTRPG podcast together over on his channel, and I've been in conversations with him from Distal's origin. Besides kind of knowing his process behind the scenes, I've also played this game in person before playtesting it for myself. Whereas most of the other games I plan on reviewing, like Call of Cthulhu or Vampire the Masquerade, I've heard of, but I'm kind of going in cold without actually having it run for me by a GM. Okay, with all that out of the way, let's finally dive in. Mechanically, Distal is a roll-high D20 system that should be familiar to any players with experience with 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. Like many other D20 systems, the core mechanic is to roll a D20, add some modifiers, and try to have your result beat some sort of target number. The action economy is almost exactly the same, just with different labels to create a more immersive experience. Each participant still gets a move, an action. In Distal, instincts are basically D&D bonus actions, and twists are D&D reactions. I will say that looking through the different lineages and classes, Distal does a much better job at balancing different instincts and twists for every character to have. One problem that has only grown more frustrating for me running 5th edition D&D games, even with the 2024 rules, is how some characters will get a quote-unquote full turn of a movement, action, and bonus action, while other players sometimes feel stuck maybe only doing an action and not really needing to move or having a bonus action available. While this still happened occasionally in Distal, it just felt like each class had a more defined gameplay loop that helped distinguish their strengths and weaknesses a lot easier than I've had beginner players able to pick up on the differences between D&D classes. Also, unlike D&D, Distal characters have 5 attributes rather than 6 ability scores, many of which are familiar. There's strength, dexterity, intelligence, and wisdom. Instead of constitution, Distal calls the 5th one fortitude, but there is no charisma skill to lean on. And this kind of removes a lot of concerns I've seen the community have, especially about the influence action in D&D 2024, where it can kind of feel like your numbers are just high enough to get what you want. A common design theme that you'll see throughout Distal is that the spaces where the mechanics aren't defined are asking the players and the GM to critically think about how to best move the story forward. Also really interesting, you do have proficiencies for skills, knowledge, and weapons, but those proficiencies don't stack on top of the attributes like in a lot of other D20 games. So for example, in 5th edition D&D, a level 1 character probably has some weapons, spells, or skills that line up in terms of proficiency and a primary ability score. So it's really common, for example, for like a fighter or a rogue to have a +5 bonus to weapon attacks, or for a level 1 druid to have a +5 perception because that's a wisdom skill. And looking at stat blocks, D&D commoners have a +2 proficiency bonus, and their stats are all much lower than that of first level player characters. The mechanics support the story that the player characters are above commoners. They're already extraordinary right from level 1. However, in Distal, attributes are really added to saving throws, damage, and act as prerequisites to use certain weapons, of which Distal has a lot of creative options. However, for the actual attack, skill, and knowledge checks, you just add your proficiency. Of the 9 pre-generated characters offered in Distal's core rules, there is one character with one option that has a +2. Pretty much everyone else has a +1, which is the same bonus as pretty much all of the enemies in the playtest adventure that I ran for myself that you can download on Distal's website, which I'll link in the description below. Because of this, the modifiers end up being a lot smaller, the math tends to be a little tighter, and one thing that you really don't do in Distal is optimize character builds. Yeah, there's an argument to be made reading through the options. Some lineages probably mesh better mechanically with certain classes, but unlike D&D where there are several opportunities to try to squeeze a little bit more out of a modifier, and that little bit ends up making a huge difference statistically, for Distal, no matter what your lineage class combination is, combat is most likely going to be resolved one way or another based on how well the player characters strategize and smartly use their resources. To go back to the math for 1 second though, Distal's math is kinda sneaky. If you listen to D&D optimizing channels, a lot of times what they'll talk about is how at certain levels, the expected statistic for an attack roll to succeed usually floats around 60 or 65%, even though your character at level 1 only has a +1 bonus in Distal. Looking at the actual stat blocks, a lot of the defense scores, again, Distal's label for armor class, usually is about 8, which again is about a 65% chance to hit. So even though the numbers are smaller, which does convey a certain tone for the world, it's not like your characters are going to be missing a whole lot of the time. It also means if you can figure out strategically how to get a little bit of a bonus, it's gonna make an even bigger difference. This brings me to Distal's willpower mechanic. At the beginning of each combat, each player character gets 1 die of willpower. The size of the die depends on the class. Some get a D6, others get a D8. Throughout the combat, like a bardic inspiration die, you can roll the willpower die to add to an attack, a check, or you can trade it in to get another use of a twist. Now, if the player characters defeat an opponent on the board, or they complete some sort of sub-objective of the fight, maybe unlocking a locked door, or maybe activating a rune or freeing a captive, then every player character gets an additional willpower die. And there is an upper limit, so you want to use them before you lose them. However, this flow of using and restocking willpower creates this dynamic rhythm to a fight that I find missing in D&D. And I'm only making comparisons to D&D a lot because, personally, it's the system I have the deepest knowledge in. And second, the core structure of the game is similar enough that for those of you familiar with D&D, it makes it a little easier to understand Distal's mechanics. But a lot of times in D&D fights, your starting resources kind of dwindle over time. And in Distal, there's this sense of you use a resource, but depending on how you use it, you may be able to get it back. So for example, in my playtest in the set piece combat encounter, I had a jester character, which is kind of like this assassin type in Distal. And I knew that the minions were pretty squishy. So I missed with my jester's attack, knowing that the big boss was going after my cut purse, kind of like a rogue. I made sure to roll the willpower die to make sure my attack hit. And when the guard minion went down, it not only replenished my jester's willpower, but it gave an additional willpower to everybody else. It is a finite resource. I made sure to only use it when I needed it, but it did add a more dynamic sense to the combat than just, I take an action, I hit or miss, moving on to the next person's turn. Now, as much as I really like what Distal's willpower mechanic adds to combat, I have to say, my favorite general mechanic is definitely death marks. In D&D, if a player character gets dropped to 0 hit points, all it takes is a little bit of healing to get them right back in the fight. As an aside, the most extreme example that I can remember personally happened in a game that we were playing when Xanathar's Guide to Everything first came out. We were all 3rd level characters, and the big boss of the evening was standing toe-to-toe with the Paladin. The boss had 2 attacks. And the way the gameplay loop worked, they would start their turn by hitting the Paladin, knocking them down to 0, and then attacking the Paladin while they were down, giving them 2 death save failures. However, the way initiative worked, I was able to cast Healing Spirit. And the way the spell worked back then, there was no limit to it. So all it would do is I'd roll a d6, the Paladin would stand up with maybe 4 hit points, take a swing at the boss couldn't move away, because of the way that we had positioned ourselves, and the boss would again knock down the Paladin, I'd heal them, the Paladin would stand back up like nothing had happened, hit the boss again, rinse, wash, repeat until the boss was dead. Not only was this situation narratively ludicrous, it was strategically boring. Death marks resolve this by giving a character a permanent reminder of their brush with death each time they drop to 0 hit points. And if your character just ever reaches their death mark maximum, they are gone for good. Now, within a single combat encounter, it does encourage player characters to keep from dropping to 0 whenever possible, but over time, this is where Distal's definition of heroism comes into play. As characters accrue death marks, they get different scars, which remind them of the battles that they've had and the times they've almost died. But it also asks them when it's time to retire. Once your character starts nearing their death mark maximum, they really have to start asking themselves if continuing to adventure and taking these big risks ends up being worth it. So, knowing that your player character is nearing their death mark maximum, let's say the plot turns in a way where their backstory starts becoming more part of the adventure. Is it worth it for them to go into a final battle? Kind of like Spike from the end of Cowboy Bebop. Or maybe they just want to play it safe and they've done their time and it's time to retire. Kind of like Frodo at the end of Lord of the Rings. As your chances for your character permanently dying go up, it makes your character feel even more heroic when they do decide that they need to act selflessly for some kind of greater good. By contrast, because of D&D's healing mechanics, and the lack of permanent consequences, even of getting resurrected from the dead, D&D can start to feel more like a comic book story, where characters kind of shuffle in and out. Death is not necessarily the end of their story, they can always get resurrected, whereas I know Michael wanted Distal's mechanics more in line with fantasy epics, where sacrifice actually meant something. Now, even though death marks are a permanent mark on the character sheet, I do agree that this is a system that makes the game grounded but not gritty. Having read through other systems, especially the ones in the horror genre, there are definitely systems where one bad roll might mean a character just bites it. And Distal isn't that punishing in terms of its mechanics, but over time, it does get you as the player to ask narrative questions that would make sense for a character actually living in a dangerous fantasy world. Now, the last design thing I want to talk about for this review is probably the thing that's going to either make you really excited to play Distal or something that may have your group pass on it, which is this is a very specific system. Willpower and death marks, I think, are easy enough systems that you could kind of plug into any D20 game, and I think they would add the same tone that they were designed for. And Distal has very specific lore and very specific designs that I don't think are easily compatible with other things. Even its name, Distal, is a type of fracture. And part of what its design is doing is fracturing away specifically from generic fantasy games. Every class has a very specific story to tell, from the Falconer to the Cut Purse to the Ember Gut. And even iconic fantasy elements like elves and dwarves have specific cultures and stories that tie into Distal's lore. Elves, for example, have skin that changes color based on the season, and dwarves are able to showcase social status with fashion and hairstyle. There are analogs for more generic options. I think the closest thing to a D&D fighter would be the strategist, and the closest thing to a D&D rogue would again be the cut purse. But whereas in D&D, I've used the rogue class to tell the story of a more traditionally heroic character, the cut purse's vibe is definitely a little bit more criminal, and the flavor really does evoke a specific story. So although I said death marks were my favorite mechanic, I don't consider this next part necessarily a mechanic, even though it has mechanical elements. My favorite part of Distal's design are the background prompt tables. I've played other games before with this kind of life path system. The thing that's kind of turned me off from them is just how specific they ask your character to be. The thing I love about Distal's prompts is that they're open-ended enough to leave room for your imagination, but they're also specific enough that they help create a surprisingly three-dimensional character just by rolling randomly. Like these background prompts, the setting and lore section has enough for some GMs to chew on and to ignite their imaginations, but it's not so dense that it asks you to do a lot of homework before diving in. Now, like I said before, the specificity of its lore and classes and lineages might be the thing that excites a lot of tables, but also the thing that may prevent some groups from fully enjoying it. For example, there are many videos online of how to port a certain iconic character into D&D's system. You know, is Thor a fighter, a barbarian, or a paladin? In Distal, because the classes are so specific to the world, you can't really one-to-one port other iconic fantasy characters directly into it. And again, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think if your group has an open mind, your players are willing to do a little bit of homework into understanding how the world works and what the tone of the game is, I think your table is going to have a blast running this game. So at the end of the day, if your group wants to run a more beer and pretzels style dungeon crawl, Distal's mechanics do offer some novel ideas, along with some class and lineage combinations that will be fun to play, but without really integrating the lore and the flavor that's in the product, I think a lot of its soul can get lost and you kind of miss the whole point. For tables that love having prompts for roleplay and discovering who their character is rather than having a fully formed idea going in, I think Distal is going to pleasantly surprise you. Again, if you want to try Distal for yourself, you can check the links in the description below. In that description, you'll also find a link to my story that I created running myself through a Trader's Do, as well as links to my playtest TTRPG, Swiftguard. Until then, have an awesome day, and remember, your story matters. Bye-bye now.